Hi, my name is Joel Telfer Jr., and I welcome you to another episode of the Bentsi-Enchill Letsa Ankomah podcast. Today we have an exciting topic for you. We are discussing the future of localization. I'm joined today by Seram Jikunu, who is a partner in our energy and infrastructure team. Welcome, Seram.
Thank you, Joel.
And Frank Akuwa, who is a partner in our financial institutions and capital markets team. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you, Telfa.
So let me begin with you, Frank. What exactly is localization and why is it relevant for a developing economy like Ghana's?
Thank you. So I think localization essentially is the concept that tries to place or keep ownership and management of businesses and the supply of goods and services to businesses in local hands. That is typically achieved through laws that specify requirements, i.e. localization requirements. Now, the issue, as you raise, is the rationale, the why. You would find that in most instances, that is to redress historical economic imbalance, to actually try and integrate local people and resources into sectors which traditionally have been dominated by foreign entities. The goal is to transfer knowledge and skills to local people, do local wealth distribution, and then safeguard national interest. In other words, not to rely heavily on foreign nationals for critical infrastructure like telecommunications and financial services as much as governments can. The scope of localization or the localization requirement differs from country to country. And so if you take the example of South Africa, for instance, they have what they call the Black Economic Empowerment, which has all sorts of requirements to help Black people come up after apartheid. Ghana, like any other developing country, also has localization requirements which are varied and cut across from sector to sector.
Let me come to you then, Seram. Is localization really relevant in terms of the sustenance of the Ghanaian economy?
It is. So in addition to what Frank said, localization is really a policy tool that is used by government to generate benefits from specific industries in order to promote broader economic development rather than from beyond tax revenue that is generated from these industries. And so you would realize that if you promote localization, you can expand the economy base if localization is utilized effectively. And some of the developments that can arise from implementing localization effectively is industrialization, improvement of consumption, and then supply chain development. So when it comes to industrialization, if you have an industry, example, the extractive sector, where you are required to develop refineries to refine products, in that way you would be industrializing if you don't already have this, and there's this requirement that you need to process commodities or gold or petroleum before they are exported. And then if you have for the power sector, we could also have a requirement that goods should be manufactured in country. And if you are manufacturing some solar panels in the country for power projects, then you would increase the industrialization base for the country. And another example will be utilization of byproducts from these industries. For the petroleum sector, you could also have the development of fertilizer industries. So if the localization policy is utilized effectively, it can lead to real economic development of the country. And then when it comes to consumption, you would realize that if you employ locals and also locals own companies, they're going to be generating revenue, they're going to be earning more, and they're going to be spending in country. And this will really lead to major development in the consumption base. It would help the consumption markets. Then when you come to supply chain, if you're requiring that locals supply these industries and they develop the capacity, then you have a strong supply chain base that you've developed in your country. So yes, localization is important if we are looking at a broader socioeconomic development from industries that are strategically important to the country.
Let me come to you on this, Frank. Sarah paints a picture of the many benefits that come with localization in terms of the sustenance of the economy and the growth of the economy across different levels of the value chain. But there are those who also believe localization may also be harmful to the growth of the economy. Just in a certain sense, can you tell us what some of these views are and if they hold sway in terms of whether or not localization can also be harmful before we delve into the proper elements of localization in Ghana?
Well, so I think people have argued that when you limit percentage holding for foreigners, that becomes sort of a barrier of entry for foreigners. And you lose out on the innovation and competitiveness that they would ordinarily bring to your local economy. There's also been arguments around if you are reserving a percentage holding for locals, because you typically don't have the required capital, because mind you, when we talk about localization or local ownership requirements, we're typically dealing with certain critical sectors: mining, telecoms, financial services, and oil and gas. These are capital-intensive sectors, and so requiring that, say, 20%, 30% of shareholding in the companies in these sectors are restricted to Ghanaians. Which is essentially saying is that you need Ghanaians who have real capital to invest in these. Typically, you will not have that. And so what people argue is that may lead to cronyism and fronting, that these foreign entities may then have to find people close to them or people that don't have money, but they become stooges for these foreign entities. In some instances, too, you may find that regulators or governments, people who are well connected to governments or regulators may then have access to these foreign entities because they will definitely go to governments or regulators in relation to these requirements, and so they may connect them. So that is also an argument against localization. You'll also have an argument around the burdensomeness of these regulations, that instead of these businesses focusing on innovation and spending money on what is required, they may have to end up spending money and time trying to comply with these. We have examples of a company spending over a year or so and still not finding the perfect solution to this localization. This is money and time they could have spent on something else. So basically, these are some of the arguments people have.
And I guess we'll delve more into that a bit later. But Sarah, you did mention that localization is usually a policy tool used by governments to increase participation and ownership. So in terms of the Ghanaian economy, what are the key elements of localization in Ghana?
Okay. So localization usually takes two forms. It's either in terms of local content or local participation. Local content is really the quantum of goods and services, local goods and services that is utilized in an industry, or the employment of personnel, financing that is used. And these goods and services and personnel must be measured in financial, you should be able to measure that. And then it could also take the form of equity participation, requiring locals to own certain percentage of companies in specific industries. So for the upstream petroleum sector, for example, you have the requirement that where you are entering into a petroleum agreement, 5% of the project should be owned by a Ghanaian, or what is referred to as an indigenous Ghanaian company. And the definition of an indigenous Ghanaian company is a company that is wholly owned by a Ghanaian, has 80% management, and then the other non-skilled staff, 100% must be Ghanaian. And then you have the services part of the upstream sector, where you're required to enter into joint venture if you're a non-indigenous Ghanaian company wanting to provide goods and services in the upstream sector. In that case, your JV must have at least 10% owned by an indigenous Ghanaian company. When it comes to the power sector, we have a requirement for 15% of wholesale supply companies to be owned by indigenous Ghanaian companies at the initial stage, and this by year 10 should increase to 51%. And for the distribution companies, it should be 30% initially and then increase to 100%. And then for brokerage and sales of electricity, it must start at 80% and increase to 100% within 5 years. When it comes to mining, mining is the only company that now has the requirement to list 20% of the shares if you are spending a specified amount of money in your company's exploration and development activities. Right now, the requirement is that if your investment is up to $100 million, then you should list 20% of your company on the Ghana Stock Exchange. And then downstream petroleum, we have downstream petroleum, which ranges from 51% to 100%. If you want to be an oil marketing company, you're required to have at least 50% Ghanaian ownership in that company. For bulk distribution companies, they have two categories. You have a Category 1 license, which requires 100% Ghanaian ownership, and the Category 2 license, which requires 51% Ghanaian ownership. And then if you also want to be a lubricant marketing company, you're also required to have at least 50% ownership being Ghanaian.
Okay, so Frank, in terms of so Sarah mentioned that there are two elements really, the local content requirement in terms of goods and services, employment, and then the local ownership requirement. And then she has dealt with some specified percentages. Are there any other percentages across different sectors of the economy in terms of local ownership?
Yes, I think in the payment systems sector, you need 30% of your shareholding held by locals, and I think in the telecom sector as well, I think it's I think 20 or 30% for the telecom sector. But beyond what she indicated in terms of the elements, I think the elements she covered, percentage holding for businesses that are in certain sectors. So if you want a license in the mining, oil and gas sectors and all, she mentioned the minimum percentage holding, and as well as the supply of goods and services. There's also the element of minimum capital requirement for foreign shareholders, so that if you're a foreigner in a certain kind of business, you have to bring in a certain minimum amount into the business. I think so far in the sectors she's mentioned, in the mining, oil and gas, telecom, there's no minimum capital requirement. But as a general rule, we have the GIPC, the Ghana Investment Promotion Center, the Act. They have a general requirement, and it cuts across all sectors, or most sectors, that if you're a foreigner and you want to go at it on your own, then you need $500,000 as a sole owner, a foreigner who is a sole owner of the business, and then $200,000 if you are in business or in a joint venture with a Ghanaian or Ghanaians. But the catch for that is that the Ghanaians must hold a minimum of 10% of the shares. And then, of course, regardless of whether you're going at it alone or with Ghanaians, if your business is a trading enterprise, then you need minimum $1 million to do that business. As we speak, I think there's a bill in Parliament which is supposed to scrap these minimum capital requirements so that it's zero, so we start afresh. So that's one of the issues that I think we may talk about when we come to the issues around going forward. So that's for that. And then again, in relation to the GIPC, they also have what we call the negative list. that if you're a foreigner, you can't operate or invest in certain businesses like taxi and car hire services, which has a fleet of less than 25 cars, beauty salons and barber shops, production of exercise books and basic stationery, and some other things. So that's a negative list for foreigners as well. Now the key issue around localization is what it means to say you're a foreigner or a Ghanaian. So it's either you're looking at an individual or a body corporate. So if it's an individual, it's fairly straightforward. You have to be a citizen. And who a citizen is depends on the constitution or the laws of the specific country. But when it comes to a body corporate, in some jurisdictions, it's restricted to, so in some jurisdictions, who a citizen is in terms of a body corporate, it may be wholly owned by citizens or partially owned by citizens. So it depends on country to country, and even in Ghana, it depends on what you're looking at. So and the Ghanaian law, for instance, when we talk about our localization, the GIP, we start with the GIPC because that has a foreign minimum capital requirements, and so they have defined who a Ghanaian is. So it's restricted to a company which is fully owned ultimately by Ghanaian citizens. The same, I think we talked about the payment system sector too. So it's the same. So I don't know if in some of the other sectors I think she mentioned the concept of
the indigenous Ghanaian.
Yeah, so there's something called an indigenous Ghanaian company in upstream petroleum and in the electricity distribution sector.
So is it wholly or just a percentage?
So wholly owned by a Ghanaian, and then management and non-managerial staff. So that's the qualification.
Okay.
So an indigenous Ghanaian company must be 100% owned by a Ghanaian.
Okay.
And then must have 80% Ghanaian management.
So that's basically what it is. Yeah.
So interesting insights in that respect, but it's not all rosy in terms of implementing localization policies in Ghana. And I'll start with you on this, Frank. What are some of the challenges with localization, especially the local ownership requirements?
Yeah, so I think when we started, I think what I said earlier is that when the issues broadly, that when you limit the percentage holding to foreigners, you have a situation where a foreigner who intends to do business in Ghana looks at the gamut of your laws and decides against that because in commercial terms, investors don't just allocate capital anyhow. There's always a formula, which is buoyed by returns and all of that. And so if you're asking them to, say, allocate 20 or 30% of their capital to a local who may not necessarily bring on board the required things to generate or propel profits, then obviously that is a barrier to some foreign investors. You also have the situation of fronting and cronyism, which is as a result of lack of required capital. Because remember, as we indicated earlier, most of these sectors that have these requirements are capital intensive. And so if you're asking locals to own daily, and so if you have a situation where these companies cannot find the requisite local investors with the right amount of capital, then that also becomes a barrier for even getting a license. Because for most of these sectors, the requirement is that when you're coming in, you must show that you have that 20 or 30% or whatever percentage there is before we give you the license. We don't stagger. I think our laws don't stagger the compliance, and so that becomes an issue. You also have a situation where for even those entities that are already existing, but somehow their regulators have introduced laws and they have to comply with those laws within a number of months or years, they end up spending money and time trying to comply, and it's a difficult one to comply with. And so a lot of money and time spent on matters other than innovation and producing what they are set up to do. So these are essentially some of the issues.
Sharon, any further thoughts?
Add on to Frank, another challenge is the capacity of local actors. Really, for local content and participation to be effective, it depends on the capacity of local actors. Where local actors do not have the skill to meet industry standards, then it becomes very difficult for the companies trying to partner with them, or it becomes difficult for companies trying to hire. So we need skilled personnel, we need companies that are financially sound, as Frank said. So we need to be able to put money into developing personnel, skills, and the capacity of companies. Because right now, companies really find it difficult to have the required personnel that they need. Some of them are not supposed to have experts, but they have to apply to employ experts because you don't have locals that can fill these positions. So for local content to be very effective, then we need to solve this problem of capacity. And then we also have the challenge of enforcement, regulatory challenges. If local content is going to be implemented efficiently, then regulators need to be able to monitor and enforce the laws properly. But we have situations where the regulator sometimes does not have the capacity to effectively implement the law because, as I said, there are people in the regulatory office that don't have the skill to effectively implement the law. And the other challenge that the regulators face is when we pass impracticable local content laws. We need to have realistic laws. So where we have laws that are difficult to enforce and we don't give the regulator the ability to waive, then it really becomes impractical for the law to be enforced. So we need to make sure that when we are setting local content laws, we look at the industry, the country, and we set laws that will be effective. For example, we have a situation in the electricity sector where a regulation requires that when you're certain equipment must be purchased from companies manufacturing them in Ghana. But we know very well that on the list of equipment that are required to be purchased from manufacturers in Ghana, there's no company manufacturing these equipments in Ghana. So why do we have a law that requires companies to purchase equipment? The regulator will really not be able to enforce such a law. And then we also have a situation where we are saying that local shareholders or foreign shareholders, this is in the power sector again, should not be able to transfer their shares to non-locals, which really, there's a difficulty there. If the company has met the minimum local content, local participation requirement, why should the foreigner not be able to transfer shares if they want to another foreigner? So that is another challenge that we have with the impractical laws.
So Frank, in light of all these challenges that we've just discussed, do you think there's any relevance to localization as a policy tool?
Yeah, so if you look at it from what we discussed earlier, the rationale for localization to sort of rebalance sense based on the political and economic history of most African countries, including Ghana, that from the colonial era, and if you take the South African example, apartheid and all, that is obviously meant to put a strategy in place that places wealth in the hands of locals. And so if you look at it from that angle, that it is purposed to transfer skills and knowledge, redistribute or distribute local wealth, and then to safeguard national interests where critical infrastructure is not just in the hands of foreigners. Then from a conceptual point of view, it is a good one. But the issue, as always, is implementation. That when we seek to implement localization requirements, what do we end up doing? Do we end up creating laws that really work and then enforcing them in the best way possible? So in terms of localization as a concept, obviously that is still a good point. But the issue is always implementation.
Seram, how do you propose we go about some of these challenges? How do we deal with these challenges so that we can, if you like, gain the full benefits or the full scale of benefits that could potentially come with localization?
So, in order to benefit fully, we need to be careful when we are designing policies and implementing them. We need to think through the policies that we develop. We need to ensure that they would be effective when we are implementing them. That's the only way we can derive great benefits. If we are not thinking through the policies and we are just putting together laws because we want local content laws, that becomes a problem, because you would have a law on your book and you're not deriving any benefit from it. So yes, local content can be beneficial, but it is the how it is implemented and how we try to derive the benefit that it can actually give.
Yeah. So I think to add to that, I think one of the key things is also to learn from the good and bad lessons that other countries have been through. So if you take the example of Kenya, for instance, I think somewhere last year, they removed an almost 20-year requirement to have, I think, 20 or 30% localization for the ICT sector. Obviously, that is because after more than a decade or so, they realized that it was not feasible. And so in terms of learning, there are two things, as she indicated. Remove those that don't work and then clarify the uncertainties. I think Sarah took us through some of the examples in the electricity sector as well. So that's sort of a cleanup, so that if you want localization, you clean up what doesn't work and then what may work, but you haven't properly defined the issues. You also have a situation where we have to look at growing localization in a more organic way. There are sectors, for instance, if you take the payment systems sector, the fintech sector, people believe that we should allow that sector to grow organically, so that we don't start day one and ask the fintechs to, by all means, have 30% Ghanaian holding. You can allow them to figure out things for a while, like 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, and then gradually introduce certain requirements, so that they would have found their feet, understood the market properly, and then you can bring that in. I think there's also the issue of giving regulators room to sort of give out waivers or exemptions when the case properly demands so, because so far, if you look at the laws we have, there's no discretion for regulators to, on the case-by-case, decide that in a given context, this particular structure that a particular person has for this works or doesn't work, because it is as simple as have 30% shareholding. That's it. You also have a situation where people argue that if you really want local people to benefit from the economy, one of the things you should rather look at doing is to improve the business environment. What does it take for a local person to actually set up a business? What are the disincentives for that? Are we also focusing on capacity building and all sorts of things that will help in terms of locals setting up their own businesses or investing in existing businesses? And then, of course, there's also the issue of capital markets. So there's the argument that if we truly want certain sectors to be in the hands of Ghanaians, then the best way to do that is to go through the capital market, because the capital markets, as we all know, affords a broader and wider access to Ghanaians. So unlike in situations where people are doing private placements and finding who some people they already know and all of that to come into the business, if you do it through the capital markets, every local person, retail people can benefit. And of course, the pension funds are also able to invest when you go through the capital markets. And as we know, the pension funds hold funds from the ordinary Ghanaian. And so the best way to actually put the economy in the hands of Ghanaians is to go through the capital market. So that's also one of the key things that has been argued.
Yes, just to sum up on this point, and I'd ask you this, Serum, in terms of the willingness or in terms of the business environment for some of these companies that we're asking to comply with local participation and ownership requirements, do you think a more staggered approach in terms of our policy formulation would get the necessary buy-in that we require?
Well, I guess it really depends on where the company is at. Because if people have invested before you're bringing about these policies, it becomes difficult for them to accept because they feel like they've already established their business. There was no such requirement when they came into the country. So such companies really do not want to participate or be forced into participating, especially when it comes to equity participation. But they are willing to do the local content aspects, which is ensuring that Ghanaians benefit from supply, employment. And so for companies like that, I guess the focus should be more on the local content. And that way, people would be happier. But when it comes to new companies, then yes, you can stagger it so that companies coming, they settle, they understand the terrain. At the beginning, they don't know the industry, they don't really know the country, and we are forcing them to partner with people. We have situations where they're getting into wrong partnership, and that creates another problem on its own.
Frank, just on one of the suggestions you mentioned in terms of the role of the capital markets. So we've seen, like Sarah mentioned early on, about the mandatory listing requirements for certain mining companies. So obviously it's something that government is beginning, or policymakers are beginning to consider. Do you see long-term this as a strategy which is feasible in terms of our localization drive?
Well, it is. In a sense, like you're saying, I think it's something that government is beginning to, or regulators are beginning to look at. If you take a look at the telecom sector, for instance, that requirement is in a condition of some of the licenses, or almost all the licenses they've been issuing these days. Now, the point is that for the NCA, for instance, they indicate that, let's say if it's a 20% or 30%, if you're able to do a listing or do a capital market transaction, then that satisfies the requirement. Now, the issue that some people have raised is that if you list the shares, there's a potential for foreign investors to take up the shares. So instead of maintaining, because there's an issue of the original percentage and then maintaining it throughout the life of the company. So in terms of the capital markets, the issue that arises is maintaining that minimum percentage at all times. But that's a secondary issue. The real issue is that, at least because the market has been created, if local investors want it, they can come for it. The issue as to the potential for foreign investors to come in and reduce the Ghanaian percentage is not as significant as trying to get a variety of Ghanaians getting on board. So it's a chicken and egg situation. But I think we should always go for what works. And what works, as we've seen already in the telecom sector, is that if you do it that way, because I think MTN is an example of that. Even though I'm not sure in terms of the statistics whether there are more foreigners within that bucket, but the issue is that it has allowed ordinary Ghanaians to participate in a company like MTN. So that works. The issue of whether that we have up to the 20 or 30% may not be an issue, because really, in terms of localization, how do we reach the point of is a 20% that will work or is a 30% that will work? It's just a number in most instances. The real issue is that you want as many Ghanaians who are willing and ready and able to participate. It's not about 50% coming in or 20%. So if we create an atmosphere where as many Ghanaians as we have from anywhere in Ghana can do participation. And I think that's the way forward.
Great. That's all we have time for. So, Sarah, let me just take your final thoughts on the future of localization. Zana.
I think that is a great policy tool, but it should be implemented effectively, and then it should be adjusted as we go along. Government needs to look at policies that are not working and adjust them so that market conditions, it doesn't affect market conditions. It doesn't prevent foreign direct investment from coming into the country. So we should implement it such that it creates a balance. Ghanaians benefit, the broader economy benefits, and then investors are happy with the policy that we are implementing.
Super. So I think just to add to that, two things, entry level, where we are creating requirements, make sure we're doing it right. And then, like she said, continue reviewing what we've done. If it doesn't work, we ditch it. If it works, we continue. So that.
Thank you so much for your very insightful perspectives. It's been a very enjoyable discussion. Thank you. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Bentsi-Enchill Letsa Ankomah podcast. Today's discussion has set the stage for a panel discussion that will delve further into this topic. We expect industry and stakeholders from the Securities and Exchanges Commission, Ghana Stock Exchange, the Minerals Commission, Petroleum Commission, and the Bank of Ghana to discuss key insights and to offer perspectives for the future of localization in Ghana. It will be on the 18th of July at the Accra Marriott Hotel. See you soon.